So autocracy, Russian autocracy refers to the power in the hands of a single ruler, autocrat. That single ruler was the Czar. The Czar looked back, traced his heritage to Caesar, right? Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, Constantine Caesar. They looked backwards to justify their rule. Alexander I fought against Napoleon, defeated Napoleonic armies, pushed them out of Moscow, participated at the Battle of Waterloo. Alexander had no love loss for liberalism. The French Revolution and everything it stood for had destroyed the European state system, and Napoleon used liberty, equality, and fraternity to march all the way to Moscow and burn Moscow. So he was not going to succumb to the temptations of any type of liberal reforms. He was going to use his power as czar to stop any constitutional changes, much less democratic changes. He was the law. When he died, a small group of Russian military officers saw an opportunity to push for constitutional change. They wanted Russia to have a constitution. France had a charter. England got a great charter in Magna Carta in 1215. Russia had no significant set of constitutional laws. The Tsar did what he wanted. These young officers had read parts of the Enlightenment. They were familiar with some of the major ideas, and one of that was that law should restrict government officials. When Alexander died, the crown passed to his second son, Nicholas I. I say his second son because the first son, Constantine, turned down the crown. He could have and should have had a legitimate claim to the throne, but he married a commoner, and Russian law, Russian principles, family law, said that since he married a commoner, his children would not inherit the crown. So he, for the love of his life, passed up the monarchy, gave it to his younger brother. The Decembrists used that moment to spread chaos and confusion and tried to seize control. Now, they had no real popular support. They had no real depth to this movement. And so the only thing they really did at the end of the day was succeed in pissing off Nicholas I. So that when Nicholas came to the throne, he too had no sympathy for liberalism. He had no sympathy for constitutionalism. He had no sympathy for dissent. He saw all of those things that came out of the French Revolution as a threat to the stability, first and foremost, of his own personal power, but also of the entire kingdom. So Nicholas created a secret police, and part of their mission was not simply to go after things like property crime, but to go after things like political crime for thinking, publishing, and acting in ways that were contrary to the interests of the Tsar. It was his country, and he would not tolerate dissent. He was an autocrat. This autocratic rule was a form of despotism. Law depended upon the whim of the individual wielding it. There were no real institutional barriers to a czar exercising or doing whatever they want. In 1785, Catherine the Great exercised her own personal prerogative and announced a charter of nobility, which laid out the rules and the privileges for nobles. So, for example, she incorporated local gentry, local landowners around the empire into this system of nobility, right? Gave them defined privileges, for example, the privilege to petition. Up until this point, if a person petitioned the czar, they could die just for saying the wrong thing. Now, if it's done properly in the form of a petition, and a noble could express their concerns, something they wanted fixed, something they needed adjusted. And then the czar would weigh that and consider that and act upon it if necessary. Nobles were free from state service, so they weren't required to do forced labor, weren't required to enter into the military. Nobles under Russian Imperial law were free from taxation. They paid no taxes. They were exempt from corporal punishment, so they could not be beaten. Your average Russian could face any form of corporal punishment, because corporal punishment was normal in Eastern societies. They had exclusive control over their own private estate. So much so that you can imagine them to be like a mini czar. On their estate, with their serfs and their peasants, they were the lawmaker, they were the law enforcer, and they were the judge. So they were the judge, jury, and executioner of anything that happened on their particular estate. They didn't have to answer to anybody. They didn't have to have a set of written laws. There were no constitutional checks on what they had to do. Their only check was not to upset the czar, because even though this charter of nobility lays out in written terms their privileges, unlike Magna Carta, there was no jury of peers. It was simply, if the czar decided to remove a noble title, the czar could remove a noble title. If the czar decided to give a noble title, they could give a noble title. It was simply up to the will of the czar. The language of these nobles was primarily French or German, because that's where the major courts were, either the Prussian court, the Habsburg court in Vienna, or in Paris. There was an institution called the Duma. This gets a later connotation of being some type of national assembly, but not really. It is more of an ancient form of curia regis, a royal council. So the czar could pick which nobles that would come in. They would advise him. They could speak freely, theoretically, unless they really pissed him off. And he would then, the czar would then make a royal decision, an imperial decision. In no way did the decisions or deliberations in the Duma control the czar, but it did give an outlet for particularly the court nobles to address the czar in a way that provided them some sense of security, right? Because there is security in numbers rather than individuals. But if we look back at this political spectrum of radical, liberal, conservative, or reactionary, and had to objectively place Russia on this scale, it's certainly not radical. It's not trying anything new, and it's not tearing down anything old. It's not even liberal. It's not experimenting with something new. And it could be considered just conservative, where it's going to preserve traditional institutions. But when Nicholas introduces the secret police, Russia crosses the threshold from conservative to reactionary, that Russian czars actively sought to root out anything new. Russian czars saw novelty as a threat to the regime's stability. So the new things like constitutions, property law, commerce law, industrialization, urbanization, any of the things that we associated with modernity, religious toleration, religious diversity, uh, political participation, all of those things that come out of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment threatened the power of the Tsar. And so czars in the early 19th century and really through the beginning to the 20th century, czars actively sought to root out and tear out anything new. This made Russia a reactionary regime at the beginning of the 19th century. The czar's autocratic power rested upon his military position in Europe. The czar found himself as part of a holy alliance, the Hohenzollern monarch in Prussia, the Habsburg monarch in Austria, and the Romanov monarch in Moscow. These three monarchs provided the bulk of continental armies that stood up against Napoleon and made sure that the secular, enlightened turmoil stayed in check. Of those three powers, Russia had the largest army. It drafted 1 to 2% of its population annually. So in the early part of the period, 41 million people. At the later part of the period, somewhere 6 million people annually conscripted going into military service. That military service then lasted 25 years. That provides millions of men on the battlefield. The Tsar's strategy was pretty simple. Massive infantry led to massive bayonet charges. This army, though, was divided regionally, and so it was not as if they were bringing in to a barrack system. Each region had its own army. The nobles from that region controlled that army. And very rarely did it all come together as a single fighting unit. The infantry was then supported by field artillery. At this period, we're still talking about cannonballs, cannons on the outside trying to disrupt an enemy infantry formation. Russians had a very superb cavalry, a traditional cavalry, but also a group of ethnic Cossacks who prided themselves on being able to raid, and by raid I mean rape and pillage. Their goal was to terrorize civilian populations and disrupt enemy supply lines, whereas a traditional cavalry really were trying to directly support infantry on a battlefield. Where the cavalry would harass the battlefield, the Cossacks would go out and try to harass behind enemy lines, and they were an effective terrorizing force to make sure local population stayed under the control of the Tsar. Because remember, this army is acting as the police force. There's no differentiation between a police force and the army at this time. The same army that was directed towards the French could be directed towards civilian populations across this empire. This army held the empire together. One of the problems facing this army was the question of Prussification. The Prussian army by this time had showed the benefits of professionalization, having officers who were trained in the military sciences, trained in history, trained in map reading, trained in orienteering, trained in drill. The Russians theoretically adopted this, and also adopted a staff system where they would try to coordinate between armies. But the Tsar was never really able to break through and replace aristocratic or noble service with a professional or merit-based officer corps. The Tsar was also not able to break through and create a cohesive and effective coordinated command and control system. So this put, even though he had a big army, these armies acted more independent of each other and sometimes ended in squabbling between nobles instead of being effective fighting force against an organized enemy. Some of the imperial questions or problems they faced was control over, for example, Poland. The Polish question remained an agitation throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, because the Tsar, along with his Holy Alliance partners, divided Poland, partitioned Poland in 1777, 1793, and 1795. On this map, you see the brown area, the green area, the blue area. The three Christian monarchs shared a common meal of Poland. So Poland lost its identity as an independent state, and these ethnic Poles found themselves under a Prussian ruler, an Austrian ruler, and a Russian ruler. Napoleon tried to rectify that with the creation of a Duchy of Warsaw when he rolled through. But when Napoleon was gone, so was that duchy. The Congress of Vienna sought about restoration. And so parts of Poland were restored to Prussia, parts of Poland were restored to Austria, parts of Poland were restored to Russia. Because at the Congress of Vienna, these conservative leaders did not take into account ethnic boundaries. The concept of self-determination, national identity was not a recognized or legitimate form for organizing political units. They were still operating under dynastic states. Before the Napoleonic Wars, 3 dynasties owned this land. They got the land after. Another big foreign policy problem for the Russian Empire was the Eastern question. This is what it was called in the early 19th century. Today, we call it the Middle East, but it's referring to the same place. For Russia, the problem was Russia was a landlocked country. Only through St. Petersburg and out through the Baltic region that the British could control, easily block up in the North Sea. Russia had no warm water ports, no way to get a navy out into the Atlantic or in the Pacific. And so it constantly sought land south of the Black Sea so that it could have a port on the Mediterranean, a port that would allow it to get its navy out of the Black Sea. So it built up a Black Sea fleet, but that Black Sea fleet was caught up or tied up at the Turkish Straits, going from the Bosphorus in the Dardanelles out into the Aegean. This became a constant irritant and a constant strategic goal for the Russian Empire. One of the excuses for that expansion then was holy sites in the Ottoman Empire, that Greek Orthodox worshippers got the short end of the stick when it came to the sites surrounding the earliest parts of Christianity, right, in Jerusalem or Antioch or even Constantinople, that the Turks were treating Greek Orthodox worshippers poorly, and Russian czars used that as an excuse to meddle in Turkish affairs. The Romanovs controlled an empire. Romanovs used traditional tools to control and dominate that empire. They rejected constitutionalism, property law, rejected freedom of the press, freedom of speech. Russia was a reactionary government at the beginning of the 19th century.